Hello and welcome back, goats, to the BigBluePurple channel, and to part 2 of the Morbol experience featuring Alexander Savage. In this video, I'll be covering the 3 Alexander raids that are required to unlock the Morbol mount in Final Fantasy XIV. If you don't know much about the Morbol or what I'm talking about, or just Blue Mage raiding in general, highly recommend you go check out part 1 of this video where I talked about the Coils of Bahamut. I did all of these Morbol fights in the Party Finder, and you can too, provided that you'd like to. It seems to me that when it comes to Blue Mage raiding, a lot of people are under the impression that you need to have a coordinated static, you need to have voice comms, you need to have this crazy setup to do any of it, when in reality, at least especially over on North American data centers, it's pretty easy to find people to do this stuff with, surprisingly. And like in terms of difficulty of this content, I would say that this is significantly easier than doing Current Savage. So if you're able to PF Current Savage, then you have nothing to worry about because this is a lot easier. You skip a lot of mechanics, much more of the difficulty comes from your ability to play Blue Mage rather than being amazing at these fights or something. And of course this is even further intensified now that we have these level 80 spells and we're just overall more powerful now. These fights have been made even easier. You probably won't even be seeing half of the mechanics in each of these fights, probably less than half in some cases. If you do plan to PF these fights, my general experience was that you would join one prog party to get a feel for the mechanics and get an idea of how the fight worked, and then from there you would just start joining clear parties. I noticed a lot of the times there weren't really any prog parties up at specific prog points, because one group fresh is usually enough to grasp the mechanics well enough to be like, okay, I'm ready to clear this fight now. At least that was my personal experience. So yeah, this isn't quite the same as doing on-content Savage, where you're going to need to join multiple prog parties for multiple prog points and different walls throughout the fight. There's usually not even a major wall in any of these fights. It's mostly just getting it all right with minimal deaths so you can sting the boss and skip the last few mechanics. This is also helped by the fact that all 8 of you are going to be bringing res. You know, if you're doing Blue Mage raiding, make sure you always have res, because you're going to be able to zombie through a lot of mechanics and make a lot of extra progress, see a lot more of the fight, simply by just rezzing your way through mistakes. It's very unlike Current Savage, where every goddamn mechanic just insta-kills you if one guy fucks it up. One of the most fun things about this Blue Mage raiding to me was just getting an idea of what old fight design was like, even if it's not the entire experience, because again, we're skipping a lot. It's still put into perspective like, design has changed a lot with how they go about creating raid fights nowadays. Anyways, I bring all this up just to say that this is 100% in the realm of possibility for pretty much anyone. These fights aren't some mind-blowingly difficult experiences. It's not like you're doing on-content Savage, and you're going to have a lot of advantages over this content given the newer spells and just given all the information we have too with the great Blue Academy guides on this fight and being able to come very prepared. Now with all that out of the way, let's talk about the first of these 3 Alexander fights with A4S, the Burden of the Father Savage. This is probably the easiest of the required Alexander raids, but it's still a decent step up from the Coils other than T13. The core of this fight is that you need to destroy the 4 legs on the boss before the main boss becomes targetable and you can finally finish him off. And each time you kill one of these legs, a new mechanic is introduced into the fight on top of the previous mechanics from each of the prior legs. It's honestly a pretty cool design, and I had a lot more fun with this fight than I was expecting to, given that I really hate the normal mode of this fight, and whenever I get it in roulette I'm like, oh god, it's this one. We start by killing the right hind leg of the manipulator before moving to the right foreleg, and then we go over to the left foreleg and then the left hind leg. That was the typical leg kill order I found in groups, but I don't think it technically matters. If your group wants to do it differently, I'm sure that would be okay. Now, usually during the first leg, there's actually this orb mechanic where orbs start chasing down players, and it's the party's job to basically make sure that nobody dies from taking too many orbs, and the healers just want to keep everyone topped up while they go and soak the orbs. Very straightforward mechanic, not a lot of depth to it. But you actually usually skip this mechanic now just because we do so much damage to the boss. During the second leg, this tether mechanic gets introduced where these little bits will spawn around the edges of the arena and tether to a player. Basically, the goal here is to make sure that no given player has more than 1 or 2 tethers on them, or it'll kill them. Taking these tethers off of people can be really janky sometimes, and you'll grab the tether and then all of a sudden it'll snapshot back onto them and kill them, and it's just really sad. But you'll get used to it eventually. It's just kind of a weird jank that this fight has. Two players also get pulled away from the rest of the party and detained while you're DPSing the second leg. This isn't a big deal as long as those players are DPS players, but in the most unfortunate of circumstances, if both your tank and your healer get jailed, it's pretty much a wipe if your DPS don't bring heal and tank spells in case they need to take over for a minute. I found with most groups, we kind of just YOLO'd it, and if we got bad RNG, we'd just accept the wipe and pull again, because it didn't happen super frequently where the tank and the healer would get jailed. It's really up to your group how you want to resolve this. You can have DPS bring Mighty Guard just in case, you can have everyone bring White Wind just in case. Ultimately, it's just a battle against RNG for the most part. Once you get to the third leg is when this fight really starts to get going. The tethers from the previous leg are still going to be present here, but you're also going to have to deal with the infamous Jagged Dolls. If you've done T, get ready for some PTSD to trigger, but if you haven't, then get ready to learn Dolls. Thankfully, Dolls are pretty forgiving and straightforward in this fight. You don't need to get them below 20 like you do in T. You can just get them below 50, and then you need to feed them to this Straff Doll in the center of the arena. There's going to be 3 Jagged Dolls around the east, west, and south of the arena. Basically, you'll assign a player to each doll, and then you'll agree on a feed order. You want to stagger the order you feed the dolls to the Straff Doll, because they do raid-wide damage when they get fed, and you want to make sure your healer has time to top people off after the doll raid-wides. Additionally, the Straff Doll that you're feeding the Jagged Dolls to needs to die very quickly, but not before he's been fed each doll, because he'll do a basically enrage cast, which will sap everyone's MP down to 0. And since we're all blue mages, MP is very important. In Party Finder, dolls are 100% the main mechanic of this fight, and pretty much the only thing you are ever going to wipe to, other than the tank and the healer getting jailed on a bad RNG run. There's not really anything specifically difficult about handling these dolls, it just requires a decent bit of coordination, and in Party Finder that can be rough sometimes. The big thing is making sure not to spend huge primal spells on the leg, because you risk hitting the Straff Doll and accidentally killing it. And if you kill the Straff Doll before it's been fed all 3 of the Jagged Dolls, then those Jagged Dolls will continuously respawn infinitely. They also get a stack of damage up every time they're killed but not fed to the Straff Doll, so eventually you're just going to have a menacing motherfucking Jagged Doll running around the arena. You'll want to get real comfortable with these Jagged Dolls, because as soon as you start hitting the 4th leg, they're going to come back. But this time, Nisis are going to be added on top of things. Now, thankfully, these Nisis are incredibly easy to resolve. They're basically a non-mechanic. We just simply have the Nisi players make sure they don't walk near anybody, they just spread out and don't touch anyone, and the healers will continuously heal them through the damage over time. We're not going to pass our Nisis anywhere, we're just going to wait for them to disappear. The only time this gets a little bit scary is that if you're assigned to a doll, and you also get a Nisi, you need to be very careful when you're feeding your doll not to pass that Nisi. I also do want to say, because I didn't specify, you want to make sure you're focusing down one leg at a time, because when you kill a leg, the remaining legs are going to get put back up to full HP. So if you lower 2 legs and then kill one of them, the other one that you lowered will just go back up to full HP. So you want to focus on one at a time. Otherwise, during the 4th leg, you're just going to be resolving all of the mechanics that you've seen from all the previous legs, the orbs, the tethers, the dolls, and then the Nisis. Those are the 4 major mechanics. After this, you're finally into the final stretch of this fight. Manipulator himself will become targetable, and now you just need to finish him off. One of the main things to look out for during this phase is a cast called Carnage Zero. This is basically just going to be a spread mechanic, because the bits from earlier are going to come back, but they're going to shoot laser beams at completely random players. So if too many players are stacked on top of each other, they're going to risk, killing each other with the lasers. You can see in this footage we cut it really close there. Otherwise, the orb soaks from earlier are going to make a return, but this time there's going to be an additional big orb that's kind of like this bluish yellow color, and this orb is going to be a big group stack. The importance of this blue orb, though, is that it's going to give everyone who soaks it a Vuln up. What this means is that the tank needs to make sure not to stack for this orb stack, or they're going to get annihilated because of the Vuln up. Finally, he'll cast Royal Pentacle, and just treat this as your Enrage, basically, as a blue mage. Don't bother resolving this mechanic. He should be within sting range here. Manipulator's sting range is absurdly high. I think it's like 30% or something. So just sting, and the boss will die. You can see some people were pretty slow on their stings during this pull, and we barely killed it before the steam regulators in the middle blew up. This fight was actually a pretty pleasant surprise. I really had no expectations for this one. I wasn't really looking forward to doing this fight. It wasn't really a fight that I looked at and went, oh yeah, Manipulator, that's my favorite boss, I can't wait to fight him. But honestly, man, like, this fight was cool. I like how each time you kill a leg, new mechanics are added on top of each other. I like how the doll feeds work. I like the coordination that asks of you. It was interesting seeing basically the original dolls having done T. So the overall verdict is that this fight is pretty good, and I think I enjoyed it more than T5 and T9 by a pretty considerable margin, but probably not more than T13. I really like T13. Now, A8S, on the other hand, is probably the most difficult of the Morbol raids to clear if you're doing it in Party Finder. Mechanically, it really isn't that much crazier than the other ones. This isn't some gargantuan difficulty shift. If you're able to clear A4S and A12S, and this is your last one or something, you're gonna be fine. It's just a bit harder. The problem is the insistence people have on using this Gavel skip macro. Basically, the last major mechanic in the fight that we see as a blue mage when the final Brute Justice spawns is Gavel. And instead of doing Gavel, we opt to use a macro that basically will final sting the boss in sync to kill him before he casts Gavel. The importance of this macro is that every player in the party hits it as soon as final BJ becomes targetable. If they don't do that, the macros will be unaligned and will be a guaranteed wipe pretty much. The reason this would cause a wipe is because how Gavel works, right, is Brute Justice is going to assign a responsibility to everyone, that's how the mechanic usually works, and if said player dies without fulfilling their responsibility, Brute Justice will read everybody's final sentence and kill everyone off. So it's very important that everybody uses Final Sting in sync with each other so Brute Justice doesn't have time to do Final Sentence. I fully believe this fight would have been significantly less frustrating to attempt to clear if people didn't use this fucking macro. Gavel is not that mind-blowing of a mechanic. Yes, it's difficult, it's probably trickier than any other mechanic you'll need to learn as Blue Mage, but learning Gavel is probably way more rewarding, far less tedious, and overall just a better experience than sitting there, getting to the final fucking phase of the fight, and failing to click a macro in sync with each other and wiping because of it. It's so fucking stupid, and I honestly kind of hate that that's become the standard for this. Unfortunately though, finding 7 other blue mages who are all on the same page and all want to learn this mechanic that is technically optional because of this macro is very difficult. People are always going to opt to take the skip route, even if I think it's technically harder, because it requires more precision and coordination from a PF group of random people. So I guess my advice to you is feel free to try the Gavel skip, but if it's not going well and you cycle through like 3-4 parties and none of them can fucking do it right, just learn Gavel if you can. If you can find people to learn Gavel with, just try to learn it. I feel like you'll just have a better experience with the fight than I did, jumping between 5-6 parties until one of them finally, thanks to the RNG gods, was able to kill the boss. Anyway, sorry, mini Gavel skip rant out of the way. Let's talk about the rest of the fight because it's no joke either. The first and probably easiest phase of the fight is Onslaughter. The only important thing to note here is that you will not be using your Moonflute opener unless you're the off tank. Everyone else is actually going to use Cold Fog as their opener here. The idea here is that everyone can actually survive the first tank buster if the tank points it at the party. It's just important that the healer applies Gobskin and makes sure everyone's topped off before the tank buster comes out so that nobody dies. But this gives you a free opportunity to proc Cold Fog right at the beginning of the fight and do huge damage without using your Moonflute opener. The reason we hold the Moonflute opener is because we want to use it on the second phase to speed things up as much as possible and make that phase much easier, since it's arguably the most difficult part of the fight. Otherwise, phase 1 is comprised of dodging Mega Beam and then assigning your 4 DPS, each a quadrant in the inner cardinals of the arena, because a Steam Regulator will spawn there, and that assigned DPS player will need to kill their Steam Regulator. The important thing to note about these Steam Regulators is that the boss could aim Mega Beam at you while you're in your little Steam Regulator quadrant. If you walk out of the little square that your Steam Regulator is in, it'll actually blow up and kill the whole party. So it's very important that if he does point Mega Beam at you, you dodge it while staying within your square. After the Steam Regs, it's pretty much it though for Onslaughter. You'll be moving on the bots phase after this, which is arguably the most difficult part of the fight, just because it requires a decent degree of coordination and using your eyes to manage each of the boss's health bars. The off-tank will keep Brawler in the center of the arena, while the main tank pulls Blaster to the east side of the arena. This is because Swindler will also spawn on the east side of the arena shortly after, and this is where we're going to use our Moonflute opener to kill both of them at the same time. The important thing to note here is that you need to keep Blaster above 55% HP until Swindler spawns. If you push him too quickly, he'll become invulnerable and it'll just be a guaranteed wipe. After Swindler and Blaster are dead, we're going to push Brawler to 50% of his HP in order to trigger the next mechanic. While this is going on, there's also these drill baits happening, where basically Brawler's arms will either glow with 2 drills or just 1 drill. If it's double drill, the closest and the furthest player will both be targeted for drills. If it's single drill, the closest player will be targeted for proximity damage from Brawler. We basically just assign the off-tank and another player to be drill baits every single time. At 50%, the Orbs mechanic will begin, and Orbs is one of the easiest to resolve mechanics for blue mages because all we do is Diamondback. As long as everybody Diamondbacks, nobody will die. And there's also going to be 2 Orbs that spawn on a random inner cardinal. To deal with these, we have our Steam Regulator positions, and if an Orb spawns where your Steam Regulator was from Phase 1, you're going to be in charge of soaking it. So in the footage you just saw, I soaked my orb because it was in the southwest quadrant, which was my quadrant. You could also assign 2 people to do orbs every single time. I thought it just made more sense to assign people orbs based on their quadrant, since then they would just use their eyes and adjust if necessary. After orbs have been resolved, we're going to push Brawler down to 10% of his HP before switching over to Vortexer and killing him first. When he does Super Cyclone, make sure you're standing in front of him with your backlined against the wall, because it's going to be a huge knockback, and it just reduces the amount of knockback you're going to be taking if you're just up against the wall. You'll be skipping every other mechanic in this phase with the lightning stuff and all that, so now you're just going to kill both of the bots, and everyone is going to go and stack up on the east side of the arena before Brute Justice spawns. The tank will also stand north in order to face him away from the party. The only thing to note during this transition is when the blue lightning starts coming out of Brute Justice, press your anti-knockback, because he's going to do a big knockback like you just saw there, and we all mitigated it so we didn't take the knockback. This is just so you guarantee yourself full uptime as soon as he becomes targetable. This Brute Justice phase of the fight is significantly easier than the bots, in my opinion. Basically, it's just going to be a lot of visual overload, and you need to make sure you're paying attention so you don't get hit by anything. First of all, AoEs are going to get baited underneath every single player where they're standing. This is why we stack up on 1. At the same time, a stack marker is going to come out, and 2 players are going to get spreads. The spread players need to run away, while the stacks stack, all while Brute Justice is shooting out a Mega Beam, so everyone needs to make sure not to be within his line of sight. Finally, the tank will bait Super Jump by being the furthest away player, and if they press J-Kick as soon as the cast bar finishes, they'll actually be able to keep Brute Justice entirely centered without him jumping all the way across the arena. After this, the tank will just take a few cleaves, you dodge Apocalyptic Ray, and the boss should die here. If it doesn't die here, he's literally just going to loop all of the mechanics that I just mentioned. That's this entire phase until he dies, basically. This now leads into the intermission of the fight, which is thankfully resolved basically by just diamondbacking everything. First of all, we have everyone throw out Mighty Guard. This is not necessary. If your healers are confident with keeping everyone up, you don't need Mighty Guard to survive this. That is a myth spread around in the Party Finder. I had a healer join my group and say, "You do not need Mighty Guard, I got you," and he did in fact have us. So if you're a confident healer and you don't feel your party needs Mighty Guard, make sure to tell them that. The most important thing about this phase is that your 2 drill baiters make sure to position because there will be drill baits happening during this. Everyone else has it very simple. First they're going to dodge the Mega Beam, and as soon as the first Mega Beam is shot, they're all going to hardcast Diamondback exactly where they're standing, and they will easily survive all of the outgoing damage. After this, the bot on the west side of the arena is going to do a line of sight mechanic. This one's a bit scary because if you are in his line of sight, you will instantly die no matter what. So you see here, everyone goes behind the legs in order to line of sight it. During this though, 2 players are going to get enumerations on them. Instead of resolving these normally, because prio systems can be pretty confusing with blue mages, we opt to have the 2 enumeration players Diamondback while away from the party, while still being out of the line of sight of the bot. Now the accursed Gavel skip begins. I'll leave a link to these macros in the description. It's a Google Doc with several macros and it explains itself pretty well within the document. Basically, as soon as he's targetable, you're going to click the first macro, and then as soon as the macro tells you to pot, you're going to pot, and then it's going to tell you to click the second macro, which you can safely mash because the macro has a lock on it where it won't let you use another macro until it's finished. It's pretty well designed for a macro, and they did the best they could to make it as easy as possible, but unfortunately Party Finder will make this as hard as possible for you. At this point, you just have to pray to the RNG gods, and thankfully in this case, our prayers were finally answered. This was a very, very non-traditional kill in the sense where we had a death and this shouldn't have worked out, but because our person with the death was good enough to YOLO their final sting and sync it up with our macros, we killed the boss. So huge shoutouts to them for actually using their eyes and doing their best to align with us. The boss literally wouldn't have died if they didn't do that. All in all though, despite all the Gavel skip bullshit and frustration, I really, really love this fight, and I do think it is potentially the best of all of the fights, other than maybe A12S, which I might prefer a little bit more. I really like A8S, and now that it's behind me, and now that I'm not constantly joining Gavel skip groups, it's easier for me to step back and go, yo, wait, this fight was actually really sick, and I enjoyed doing it a lot. It houses one of the only ads phases in this game I think is genuinely fun to do. I think the bots phase is incredibly well designed. Even as Blue Mage, when we're cheesing a whole bunch of shit and not seeing the whole phase, it's still an enjoyable ads phase, and I didn't feel like I was bored or annoyed to be there on any given pull. Overall, A8S was a fantastic fight, and I just want to say, don't be afraid of this fight, even if it looks a bit more daunting than the other ones. You'll get the hang of it, it's really not that crazy, and as frustrating as Gavel skip can be, if you do opt to use it, you will kill eventually. It's just going to require a lot of resilience and patience. And now we can finally talk about the final and my favorite of these three Alexander raids, A12S. I actually did this one first out of all the Alexander raids just because I was able to find parties for it a bit easier. I absolutely loved this fight, and this out of all the fights was one where, like, because I had done T prior to this, there was a lot of overlap with the mechanics, and when we got to time stop, I was like, oh yo, I've literally done this exact same mechanic but harder. Like, I know how to do this. And that was a really cool feeling, to be honest. The first phase of this fight goes down in about 10 seconds thanks to your Moonflute opener, and you'll be straight into the ads phase. For the ads phase, the party just stands in the center of the arena and spams the Dragon's Voice. It's like a massive AoE spell. And because the tank's going to be running in this circle pulling these ads around, you'll be hitting them no matter what, and they'll die very quickly. The second set of ads will also be killed just by spamming the Dragon's Voice, but something cool you can note here is because the ads here do a raid-wide, you can proc Cold Fog and use it for the next set of ads if you use it right at the end of this phase. This can be a big help in bursting down the bigger ads quicker, because these two bigger ads that spawn are pretty damn threatening to the off-tank and main tank. They're going to have to be diamondbacking a lot due to the casts, and it's overall pretty stressful for them, at least to my knowledge. So if you can use Cold Fog here and get some extra damage, make sure to do that. It will help out your party a lot. The kill order for these two is going to be Might first and then Time. You basically want to kill Might as quickly as possible in the case that your off-tank dies, so that the main tank can just immediately go and grab Time. You can see it in our footage here that the off-tank actually died and someone else had to diamondback the tank buster, so make sure to just keep your eyes peeled during this phase and help your party in any way that you need to, depending on how things go. This phase isn't going to be terribly difficult, and you practice it a jillion times anyway because it's like the first mechanic, so you'll get very used to doing this. The phase transition is resolved exactly how you would expect it to be. We just have to Diamondback. We obviously can't tank LB, so everyone needs to make sure they have Diamondback and enough mana to use it. And now the actual fight begins. Alex will spawn in the center of the arena. Make sure to spend all your huge damage spells on him while you have the chance, because he's soon going to start casting Temporal Stasis. I recommend during this cast, don't worry about greeting damage, don't worry about anything, we have plenty of damage. Just look at what debuff you have and go to your spot. If you have a Defamation, which is a purple debuff, you're going to go to the east, south, and west cardinals. If you have a Shared Sentence, you're going to go to either the 1 or 2 marker, and you're going to jump to signify to your other Shared Sentence player that you've claimed that marker. If you have the Restraining Order tether, which is blue, one of the players is going to go stand with the South Defamation, they won't die, because tether damage will not be lethal, and the other player will just go stand with one of the shared sentences. Shared sentence is a 2-player stack, and you cannot stack the stacks, just like any other stack marker in the game. There's another tether debuff called House Arrest that you could possibly get here instead, which is the opposite of Restraining Order, right? You need to be close to each other instead of far from each other. So instead of going with the Defamation, both players are going to go stack with each shared sentence. The House Arrest tether is also commonly known as Christmas tether, and you'll see it later in Time Stop 2. Immediately after Time Stop, Alex is either going to cast Radiant Sacrament or Sacrament. Radiant Sacrament is just a donut AoE, you'll need to run underneath him. If he casts Sacrament instead, it's going to be the lasers you saw back in normal mode, where the blue lasers surround him and you need to stand on basically the inner cardinals of the boss hitbox. After this, you have some more time to do DPS before Time Stop 2. This time, only 2 people will get Defamations, while 4 people will be tethered with each other. In this case, both of our tethers were Restraining Orders, but it could be anything. It could be 2 House Arrest, 2 Restraining Order, or 1 of each. It's just random. The way you resolve it is still effectively the same. Time Stop is the major mechanic in this fight, and all it really is just a memory game. As long as you remember what debuff does what, you'll have no problem resolving this mechanic. I will once again recommend the Blue Academy YouTube channel and the guides over on there if you want more specifics on how to resolve these mechanics, since I'm kind of just briefly going through them. In terms of the Party Finder experience, though, you will spend the most amount of your time dying to the time stops as people get a hang of it, because after time stop, there's really not much else you're gonna have to worry about. Although, one major thing you always need to be making sure of is not to stand with the main tank, because they're constantly going to be taking cleaves and busters that have a massive cone. So just don't stand with them. The amount of times I saw people dying to that was genuinely sad. The next mechanic is Time Gate, which is also in normal mode, but it functions a little bit differently than normal mode here in Savage. The DPS players are each going to take one of the northern portals, so only 2 DPS are actually going to go through the portal. The southmost portals are going to be for the off-tank and for the healer. This is because the 2 adds in the south portals hit a lot harder and require substantial mitigation or healing to survive, whereas the adds in the north gates are meant to just be burnt down by a DPS. I would recommend using primal spells here just to burn these adds down as quickly as possible, because you really don't have a lot of time to kill all 4 of these adds. Once your own add is dead, you can jump to another platform and help someone else out. Always make sure to go over to either the tank or the healer closest to you, since they're going to need the most help rather than the other DPS. That's why I went to my left instead of my right, because the healer was on my left. Now, I don't actually have footage of what's going on outside of Alexander during this point, but on the outside, players are going to be getting these AoE markers on top of them, just like normal AoE markers you see in any other fight. The catch here is that they're going to drop a crystal underneath you, and these crystals need to be placed on specific edges of the arena. We have a specific marker set up for this, and if you do this in PF, it's very likely someone will bring these markers for you to make this stuff as simple as possible. We need to place these crystals on the markers because when Alexander does the next mechanic called Inception, he's going to teleport to a random side of the arena, and the crystal is basically going to tell us where he is so we don't die. When he casts Inception, he's going to teleport to a random side of the arena, and the crystal will show you with this big proximity marker that that's where he is. So you're going to have to go far away from that and to the side of him because he's going to do Sacrament, the laser beams. And then immediately after Sacrament, he's going to do Radiant Sacrament, which is the donut, so you're going to run underneath him. After this, congratulations, the boss will be in sting range, provided your damage is half decent, and he will die now. You won't have to worry about Inception 2 or anything after it. I would highly recommend just treating Inception 2 as you're in Rage, because the mechanic can be quite difficult to solve. It's basically Time Stop and Inception happening at the same time, with all those different debuffs. It's not impossible, but in PF it could be pretty hard to pull off, so I just recommend killing him right after Inception like we did. This fight is a lot of fun, and it's surprisingly easy as well, especially as someone who had seen pretty much all of these mechanics in some way or another through the Epic of Alexander. If you end up doing this as your final Morbol raid after Brute Justice, it'll serve as a nice victory lap in comparison. There's no Gavel skip bullshit going on here, there's no weird Blue Mage jank. This fight just feels really smooth and well made, even for Blue Mage. I'm very glad I got to experience A12S, at least in some capacity. I was always super interested in this fight even before I did T, and then after doing T, I was even more interested in this fight to see what mechanics originated here. So it was super exciting to get to see all that stuff. I really enjoyed A12S. If I had to rank these fights based on difficulty, I would say A4S is probably the easiest one, just based on the fact that the mechanics repeat a bunch, so you get a lot of practice with them in very little time. I would then say A12S is the next easiest, and it's really not that much harder than A4S. It's just a bit more of a memory game. And then I would say A8S is the most difficult because you need to manage the bot's HP, you need to be really comfortable with doing that, and you need to not mess up during intermission or during the brute justice phase so that you have the maximum amount of damage when you go into the macro phase. A8S is definitely the most punishing because of the macro we decide to use. I imagine if you go about learning Gavel for it, it'll actually be a lot less difficult, ironically, even though Gavel is a pretty tight mechanic and it's not necessarily easy. I think it's just that learning a mechanic that is meant to be solved is a bit more intuitive than trying to get 8 people on the exact same timing 6 minutes into a fight. So like, every pull is going to be like 6 minutes or around that, which isn't terribly long if you've done current Savage or Ultimate, but it's still like, damn, that's 6 minutes of my time gone over and over and over again because the fucking macros aren't lined up with each other. I will say though, if you're in a static and you guys have good communication and you think the macro will be easier for you, it'll 100% be easier for you because the macro is very much designed, I think, for a team with good communication, and Party Finder is not that. But again, that's not to say that this is impossible in PF or something. I did it very casually, I would say. I did not hardcore grind these fights by any means. I did these on and off for 2 or 3 weeks and didn't really start grinding them until I was on A8S at the very end and really wanted to finish off my mount. So this is 100% content you can take very casually and very slowly if that's how you want to approach it. Party Finder really is a fantastic tool, and no matter how much I rail on the Party Finder and make jokes about how bad people are in it or whatever, it's seriously an amazing tool, and I'm so glad it exists because I would never clear any of this content in this game that I pursue doing if it weren't for PF. I'm just really not the type of person for a static at the moment. With all that being said though, if you made it to the end of this video, you are a real one. I know this was a very long video, even by my standards. There's just a lot to say about these raids. I didn't want to make this a full in-depth guide, but I was hoping to give a good enough outline on the fights so that you could watch this video and be like, okay, I'm going to go try A4S now. I think I have an idea of what's going to happen in that fight. I just hope that one person watching this video sees this and goes, you know what? I'm going to go get my Morbol now. I'm going to try doing these raids because I assure you, this is such a fun and awesome experience. I wouldn't be sitting here waffling about these raids for 30 fucking minutes if I didn't enjoy doing them. This was some of the most fun I've ever had in this game, and it was such a relaxing and nice experience coming out of current Savage, like I said in my previous video. There's very little animosity and frustration in Blue Mage raiding. Everyone's in it together, they're having fun. They're goofing around playing Blue Mage. It's not this serious hardcore grind fest. We're just here to have some fun, man. So if you're at all interested in this content, please give it a shot. I promise you it's within your skill range, it's within the realm of possibility. Even if you're someone who's never raided in your entire life, but this looks like something you would enjoy, give that shit a try. I guarantee you you'll have a lot of fun. Otherwise, if you are somebody who's gotten your Morbol, let me know in the comments what you thought of doing this, especially if you did this back when it was more current. Not even just like level 70, but back when we only had the level 60 spells and we didn't have crazy shit like Nightbloom and Phantom Flurry. I hadn't even considered how much more difficult it would have been before spells like that. And also, if you're somebody who's done the Eden raids or the Omega raids as Blue Mage, I'd love to hear about that in the comments because that's something that in the long term I'd really like to do as well. I'm so interested in those Eden fights because I didn't get to experience them. I wasn't playing the game when those were current content. So when I look at shit like Titan Savage or Shiva Savage, it looks so cool to me. And I'd really love to experience those fights. So if you did those on Blue Mage, let me know what it was like. Let me know what you thought of them. Do you recommend giving that a shot? Do you think a static will be required for those? Or do you think Party Finder will be able to do Eden as well, even if it's quite a bit more difficult? I also want to apologize that this video is a little bit later than I had initially planned. I said this would come out a week after the initial video, and now it's closer to 2 weeks. I ended up getting sick with some sort of cold or bug that was affecting my voice, and I just really wasn't happy with how I was sounding in the recording, so I ended up just kind of waiting it out until, now my voice sounds relatively normal again. With all that being said though, thank you all for watching. Remember to drop a like on the video, but only if you did, and subscribe to the BigBluePurple channel if you're not already. I make near weekly Final Fantasy XIV uploads.